Knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement.
Well, wait a minute. It did come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally
This committee will allow the witness to respond.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating.
Quite an exchange there. Breaking right now, Senator Rand Paul has requested a criminal referral against Dr. Anthony Fauci. The letter has just been sent from his office. He claims that Dr. Fauci, as you saw there, lied to Congress about U.S. funding for gain-of-function research in Wuhan. Now officially in the hands, that letter, of the Department of Justice. I spoke with the senator just moments ago. Senator, good to have you with us once again. Thank you. So you basically accused him of lying before Congress. Now you've sent a letter to the Department of Justice asking for them to do an inquiry. So the basis, as I understand it, is that he claimed quite clearly that there was never any U.S.-funded gain-of-function research that was happening at the Wuhan lab. And you say that they're being sort of cute with the definition of what gain-of-function is. Can you explain that in basic terms to our audience?
Well, I think it's important to know that Dr. Fauci has a self-interest in obscuring any relationship or responsibility for anything done in the Wuhan lab. Without question, the evidence we presented in committee yesterday shows that the NIH was funding research in Wuhan. We showed the exact numerical series of numbers that goes with the grant number. So yes, they were funding the Wuhan lab. The second question is whether or not the research was gain of function. The NIH actually defines gain of function, and I read that definition to him, but he didn't listen. The definition is that any kind of animal virus that occurs in nature that affects animals only or infects animals only, if you recombine it or mutate it or adapt it in the lab with other viruses, so it has characteristics that change it from being an animal-only virus to being a virus that now can infect humans, that you've gained in function. You've gained pathogenesis or you've gained virulence. You've made it more dangerous.
Yeah.
Without question, this is what happened in the Wuhan lab. We have a number of professors who have said so. We put the quote up from a professor of 30 years at Rutgers, tenured professor, who said that what they were doing in the lab in Wuhan was the epitome of gain of function. But you have to realize that Dr. Fauci's not disinterested. If this virus came from the lab and it becomes clear that he was funding dangerous research, moral culpability, responsibility attaches to him, and he does not want that. So he's shirking that. But in so doing, he's not being honest with the American people or Congress. So
he claims that you lied about him. He says that there was no gain-of-function research that was funded by U.S. dollars. And of course, you know, the scariest aspect of this would be if there was any link between the dollars that went from the United States to potentially the actual virus that leaked. And he at one point said to you, is that what you're suggesting that I, was connected to? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, he once again set something up that we weren't suggesting. He was saying that the viruses discussed in the paper that we presented from Dr. Shi, the bat scientist, that those viruses were not COVID-19. Well, we were not alleging that. We're not alleging that Dr. Shi wrote a paper talking about how she created COVID-19.
In 2017.
We're saying that she was doing gain-of-function research. The paper proves it. And the one way to get to the bottom of this, Fox could do this. You could bring in 10 disinterested scientists in this field and ask them, is this gain-of-function research? There are a bunch of them that will speak on this, but there are many of them who are frightened because their livelihood depends on NIH dollars, and Dr. Fauci controls that money. Yeah. But there are a number of them that have been discussing this all the way back to 2002. The professor that we brought the quote from, he says he's been interested in gain-of-function research and limitations that we should have on it since 2002.
So let me ask you this. What response do you expect to get from the Department of Justice, and do you think that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, will want to pursue this issue?
I assume they'll act in a very partisan way and they will not pursue this. But the thing is there are ways that the public can also pursue this. If the public wants to get to the bottom of who's right, who's telling the truth, myself or Dr. Fauci, convene a panel of scientists and ask them if what Dr. Shi was doing was gain of function. I think you'll be shocked that the vast majority of scientists will say, yes, it's gain of function, it meets the NIH definition. Right now, Fauci's getting away with this because no one's questioning him. He only goes on left-wing networks. They give him easy questions like, ha, 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 isn't Rand Paul so out there? That's the kind of questions he gets. Nobody asks him, well, why isn't it gain of function research? And why, if this science says it's the epitome of gain of function, how are you still denying it? People have to understand there is a self-interest in preservation for Dr. Fauci not to be associated with the Wuhan lab and not to admit that he helped to fund this research.
And it's worth pointing out that there was a ban against gain of function research, which had at one point been funded by the NIH to sort of make viruses more virulent so that they could figure out how to fight them if they happened to get out into the population. There was a ban on it. So that's why the definition of what it is becomes very important, because if they kept doing it, despite the fact that there was a ban, it needed to be defined as something else. And that's what Dr. Fauci is saying here. I just want to mention real quickly, Josh Rogin has done great reporting on this for the Washington Post. He came out, he said, hey guys, Rand Paul was right, Fauci was wrong. The NIH was funding gain of function research in Wuhan, but the NIH pretended it didn't meet their gain of function definition to avoid that oversight mechanism, as I was just saying. Sorry, not sorry if it doesn't fit your favorite narrative. That from Josh Rogin, who has covered this in depth from the Washington Post. Senator, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, sir. Good to see you today. You bet.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I call up Cruz First Degree 2. This is an amendment that would prohibit U.S. participation in the creation of a vaccine passport. And let me say, I think there are a lot of Texans, I think there are a lot of Americans across the country that are very frustrated at the government responses to COVID-19. And I think the decision yesterday by the CDC to reverse its guidance and to mandate masks for vaccinated people is the kind of decision that is infuriating people across this country. I believe the CDC's decision yesterday was politics. It wasn't science. It was a decision that somehow pretends vaccines don't work. The CDC months ago rightly concluded that vaccinated people don't need to wear masks because the whole purpose of a vaccine is not to get the disease. That decision was right. The science hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is the politics. A year and a half ago, the CDC was one of, if not the most respected scientific and medical organization in the country. Today, the credibility of the CDC is in tatters because leadership of the CDC has been willing to allow science to become politicized. We've seen Dr. Fauci take virtually every position on virtually every subject under the sun. We've seen Dr. Fauci in his emails explain his view that masks don't work and are not effective in preventing COVID-19. We've then seen Dr. Fauci change his positions over and over again. We've seen Dr. Fauci say that when he told people masks didn't work, he actually believed masks did work, but he wanted people not to wear masks because he wanted first responders to have them first. I believe that when government scientists and health experts allow politics to trump the science, it does enormous damage to the willingness of the American people to believe anything they have to say. I think one of the aspects of yesterday's decision that illustrates the arbitrariness of this is the brand new decree that everyone in schools must wear a mask. Doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not, if you enter a school, you must wear a mask. Now, there's no great new scientific discovery that mandates this new edict. Indeed, we've seen throughout this crisis that while COVID-19 can be very, very serious for vulnerable populations, for the very elderly, for those with significant comorbidities, that we've seen the incidence of serious disease with COVID-19 among children is very, very low. And there's no credible demonstration that children are a significant vector for spreading the disease. But CDC nonetheless said anyone who steps in a school must be masked. It's not complicated why. They did so because the teacher union bosses demanded that. That is a political decision. Political players can make political decisions. It wouldn't surprise me to see elected officials deciding I'm going to give the union bosses what they demand, but that is not what the Center for Disease Control should be doing. My view on COVID, it is serious. We should take serious steps to combat it. We have taken extraordinary steps to combat COVID-19, including an unprecedented effort to develop vaccines, hundreds of millions of which have been administered, as we've come together and fought against this disease. But we've also seen stupid policies. We've seen lockdowns across this country that have shut down small businesses, destroyed restaurants, destroyed bars, destroyed generational businesses. We've seen schools shut down. Tens of millions of children sent home for over a year. Children who are falling behind academically, who are falling behind in reading, who are falling behind in math. And the children being hurt are disproportionately low income. They are disproportionately Hispanic and African American. And nonetheless, the edicts to shut down schools have continued. They were utterly unjustifiable. My view is simple. We should not have mandates. What does that mean? That means no mask mandates. That means no vaccine mandates. And I will say, it was interesting as I was reading through this COVID bill, Section 107, talking about what foreign governments are doing. An awful lot of the description of foreign governments can apply to our own government. So Section 107 of this bill says certain foreign governments have taken measures in response to COVID-19 that violate the human rights of their citizens without clear public health justification. Well, I think you could delete the word foreign in that because we've seen governments here domestically arbitrarily exercising power as well. This Section 107 also says governments using the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext for repression have undermined democratic institutions, check. Debilitated institutions for transparency and public integrity, check. Quashed legitimate dissent. I might remind you that Anthony Fauci in those emails asked Facebook to silence anyone who said anything different than the government directive on speech, including if you suggested the origin of the Wuhan virus was actually in Wuhan, China, in a Chinese government lab. And Facebook willingly complied, censored that view. You're not allowed to have that view that this escaped from the government lab. Then, miraculously, a couple of months ago, the administration was forced to recognize, well, yeah, there's actually very significant evidence that the Wuhan virus escaped from a Chinese government lab in Wuhan, and beyond that it may well have been developed with government research with American taxpayer funding on gain-of-function research. Those views that were banned for a year are now acknowledged as having very significant scientific basis behind them. My view, there should be no mandates, no mask mandates, no vaccine mandates, and no vaccine passports. And what my amendment focuses on is just the last piece of it. Vaccine passports, and I will say finally, this should be a proposition that is bipartisan. The Biden administration at least claims to oppose vaccine passports. Jen Psaki at the White House said, let me be clear on this. I know there's a lot of questions. Psaki said, the government is not now, nor will we be, supporting a system that requires Americans to carry a credential. If that is right, if that is credible, then I would urge the committee to adopt my amendment prohibiting U.S. taxpayer funds from going to or the American government participating in an international body creating a vaccine passport that would be required for Americans traveling abroad.
I have a number of questions and concerns about the substance of this amendment. However, the text of this amendment is clearly outside the scope of the Foreign Relations Committee's jurisdiction. Indeed, the text is drawn directly from S. 1932, a bill sponsored by the senator from Texas that has been referred to the HELP Committee. This amendment prohibits the use of federal funds for the creation of a vaccine passport system or vaccine tracking database, including at the state level, and it requires that COVID-19 vaccination records be destroyed by all federal departments and agencies. Neither of these issues fall within our committee's jurisdiction. Accordingly, I rule this amendment out of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I think that jurisdictional argument is not justifiable based on the underlying bill. The underlying bill is about policies engaging in a bilateral basis in response to COVID. This amendment is prohibiting participating in an international organization creating a vaccine passport. This bill talks about vaccine monitoring. And this amendment ensures that we're not establishing a federal government vaccine database that is monitoring U.S. citizens in violation of their privacy rights. This bill talks about enhancing transparency of health data, and I think the amendment would protect the privacy of health data from a vaccine passport. And this bill also talks about establishing partnerships with the private sector to improve pandemic preparedness and response. This amendment addresses the same topic, to prevent the U.S. government from working with a third party in the private sector to develop a vaccine passport and force it on the American people. And so accordingly, I appeal the ruling of the chair that the amendment is out of order.
The Senator appeals the ruling of the chair that the amendment is not in order because it is outside of this committee's jurisdiction. The question for the committee is, shall the decision of the chair be overturned? A yes vote means you wish to allow the amendment. A no vote means you agree with the chair that the amendment should not be allowed. As such, I will vote no.
A closing statement to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman for yielding. When this virus initially came on the scene, Dr. Fauci initially told the American people you don't need to wear a mask. Then he later said, no, you need to wear a mask. Then he said, no, you need to wear 2 masks. Then after that, he said, no, back to 1 mask. Then of course, we went to no mask, and now he's talking about we need to wear a mask again. When it comes to the question of the origin of the virus, Dr. Fauci's had just as many positions. He initially said the United States taxpayer money did not fund the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He later changed that and says, no, we did fund it, but it was through a sub-grant. Then he subsequently said, no, we funded it, but we did no gain-of-function research. And then just last Sunday, he said, well, we funded it. There was gain-of-function research, but it was a sound scientific decision. And then he said this: it would have been negligent to not fund the lab in China. I mean, talk about being all over the board. I'll tell you what's negligent. Negligent is Dr. Fauci's ever-changing statements to the American people regarding the subject matter that this committee should be looking into. I want you to look at this email that we got through the FOIA, that others got, that we were able to view through the FOIA request about, this goes clear back to January 31st, 2020, a 10:32 p.m. email that Dr. Fauci received from Dr. Christian Anderson. Dr. Christian Anderson is one of the individuals who gets our tax dollars. The folks I represent, their tax dollars. Dr. Anderson sent this email to Dr. Fauci, and he said this: the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look really closely at all the sequence to see that some of the features look engineered. And that last clause is the key. Some of the features of this virus look engineered. He went on to say further, I should mention that after discussions earlier today with Eddie, Bob, Mike, these are other virologists, other doctors around the world who receive our tax dollars via grants from Dr. Fauci. Eddie, Bob, and Mike and myself all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. That's a fancy way of saying it's not consistent with evolutionary theory. So the virus looks engineered, not consistent with evolutionary theory. Less than 24 hours after this email, the very next day, less than 24 hours later, Dr. Fauci organizes a conference call with 11 virologists from around the world. He's the only person from the government on that call, and that's where they talk about getting their story straight and what they're going to tell the American people, even though one of the top scientists in the world says this virus is engineered, this virus is not consistent with evolutionary theory. Now, we don't know what happened on that phone call because every single email regarding that phone call, every single one, has been redacted. I hope the majority will actually join us in calling for these to be unredacted and given to this committee. Every single one's read. We do know what happened 3 days later. Dr. Anderson changed his story, and he went from this virus looks engineered, this virus is not consistent with evolutionary theory, to you're crazy if you think it came from the lab. I find that interesting because one of the guys who testified 4 weeks ago when Dr. Fauci wouldn't was Dr. Giroir, who's testified in front of this committee a couple times, former Assistant Secretary for Health. Here's what Dr. Giroir said. I believe it's just too much of a coincidence that the worldwide pandemic caused by a novel bat coronavirus that cannot be found in nature started just a few miles away from a secretive laboratory doing potentially dangerous research on bat coronaviruses. Well, Shazam, that's pretty common sense. Dr. Fauci, I think, was on notice of this very fact clear back on January 31st, 2020. What we all now see as common sense, Dr. Fauci continues to downplay, continues to say is not true. And here's what's interesting. This Thursday, we just found out, this Thursday, the majority has asked Dr. Fauci to come back in front of this committee for a third time. Third time. But guess what? It's not going to be public. It's going to be private. Private briefing. After all these concerns have been raised, you got what Dr. Giroir said, you got what everyone says. Anyone with common sense now knows the most likely origin of this virus was that lab in Wuhan, China. The Democrats bringing Dr. Fauci back, but he won't be in public. A private briefing. Why? Why won't you do it publicly? Dr. Fauci's testified 18 times in front of Congress. He's been on every news show you can imagine, more than once. You can't go a day without seeing him on TV. But now the Select Committee on Coronavirus won't bring him in for a public hearing to address these issues. Nope, it's going to be private. As I said earlier, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal think we should get to the bottom of this. Pretty much everyone thinks we should get to the bottom of this, except the Democrats on the Select Committee on Coronavirus. So I hope at least the majority will join the minority and say, at least give us the unredacted emails from this all-important meeting on February 1st, 2020, where these guys, I believe, got their story straight and decided to mislead the American public for over a year about the origins of this virus. I hope the majority will at least join us for that. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I would like to say that in view of his comments concerning the briefing,